All right, so in this module, we're going to discuss single system design or single subject design. This is one of my favorite topics of the semester, and I actually teach Social Work 793 as well, which is basically an entire course focused on single system design. So if you're taking this course with me, chances are you might end up taking 793 with me if you're moving on to the MSW at UWM, or if you're already in the program. For this module, I'm going to cover the foundations of single subject design, including repeated measures, baseline, treatment phase, and then we're going to be kind of interspersing some information about graphing. And I'm hoping to give you a real example of a goals table here. And I'll post an article to the website as well. So Chapter 8 of Engel and Schutt covers single subject design. And again, this is kind of like an abbreviated version of everything that single subject design is. But I'm hoping that this will give you a good overview of what to expect and kind of an overall idea of what single subject design actually is. So some of the foundations of single subject design are repeated measure of the dependent variable. So when coming up with a single system design, or an SSD, as I'm going to call it for the rest of the module, is coming up with one operationally defined problem and measuring it at baseline to get an idea of what would the problem be if there was no intervention implemented. So the baseline phase, often indicated by the letter A, and then a treatment phase, or phase B, which is after the intervention is implemented. How does the outcome variable change? And graphing is also an important of single system design. SSD allows us to provide feedback to the client about patterns and changes and observations of their dependent variable and how that's changed with the intervention and how it's changed over time. So when it comes to baselining, or phase A, our preferred method is to measure the target or the operationally defined problem prior to implementing the intervention. And the reason that we baseline is to try to get an idea of essentially what the problem would be like if we did not come into play. And that helps us give a little bit of better idea of causality. There's more advanced experimental designs that give us a better idea of causality that I'll cover later in the module. But the majority of SSDs are just an A and a B. So baseline and intervention. And again, lots of times people can't postpone an intervention, or sometimes it's unethical to postpone an intervention. So people might give a retrospective baseline, what they think that they've been doing for the past couple weeks or couple months. A common one that people do for my 793 class is number of minutes exercise per week. So as opposed to postponing an intervention, which may be the SSD itself, people might give a retrospective idea of how they've been exercising or what they've been doing or what their common behaviors have been like. All right, so the baseline phase is a period of time before the intervention and identifies the status of the client on all variables we look to change throughout the experiment. So this provides us with some control. It's similar to like a comparison group if we were talking about experimental design in the previous chapter. A baseline is a way to compare a client's outcome measure to themselves, essentially, where they're acting as their own comparison or control group. In a baseline, measures are taken until a pattern emerges. Patterns can include a stable lines, trends, or cycles. Sometimes things are just stable and their baseline has been the same and nothing's really changed. And sometimes there's trends. We might notice that somebody has been getting worse and they would expect to get worse throughout the baseline, or potentially the opposite. Maybe people have been getting better and even without an intervention, they would have expected to keep improving. And sometimes there's cycles. Like we might notice in a baseline that somebody's kind of getting better and worse. Sometimes it's to do with days of the week or different circumstances that they're in throughout the week. Maybe some days they work from home and some days they travel. And we can see ups and downs that fluctuate with that. And then we can kind of modify our target of our intervention to address that issue. So the patterns are in the baseline measurement controls for several threats to internal validity in a single subject design. So getting an idea again of the baseline can really help us to show if the intervention was associated with any kind of changes in the dependent variable. And this helps us to kind of give a little bit more statistical control towards that. All right, so B, the intervention phase, is the time period in which the intervention is obviously implemented. The same outcome variable is being measured here, the same dependent variable using the same measures, and data from the treatment phase is compared to the baseline phase. So you can see that the baseline is just going to be measuring a point in time where there's no intervention, what would be expected to occur, followed by the intervention phase where you've implemented whatever you're doing, whatever the intervention may be, whether it's therapy or group support or whatever it may be. Once the intervention is implemented, how is their outcome variable affected by that? And we can use graphs to kind of facilitate the monitoring and evaluation of the impact. An example here, this is just a graph data, real simple, A-B, baseline phase and an intervention phase. So on top, you can see anxiety across the vertical axis. So on a scale of 0 to 16, their rating of anxiety, and across the horizontal axis is the number of classes. I would hope that maybe students have experienced something similar to this. So interestingly enough, this is pretty close to the module that you're in right now. So potentially for the first several classes, maybe your anxiety was a little bit higher, and then we could do like a hypothetical intervention of phase B as maybe weekly meetings with your instructor. And through those weekly meetings, you can see a significant positive discontinuity associated with the intervention phase, and that there's a drastic drop of anxiety here. Or maybe not drastic, but clinically significant, it appears. And on the bottom, I talked about those trends that we mentioned. So this would be an example of in phase A, the baseline phase, somebody's getting increasingly anxious with each progressing class. And without phase B, we would expect that they would continue to get more and more anxious. Versus in phase B here, where there is the intervention of meeting with the instructor, we can see there's a clear downward trend in their anxiety that would expect to continue as well. So with weekly meetings with the instructor, we would expect that this person's anxiety would continue to decrease. So when we're measuring the targets of our intervention, it's important to determine what to measure. So the intervention target can come from client discussion, elements of an individual's problem, etc. I'm going to go through a goals table to try to discuss a little bit further what I mean by all this. So when we're coming up with a single system design, the goals table that I was mentioning kind of breaks down what the client concern is, what they're coming to the practitioner to address, and then operationally defining that as trying to put like a number to the problem. Also, some of the concepts that we discussed were verifying sources, goals, and interventions. So this is an example of a completed goals table. Here could be an example of a client who's concerned about urges to gamble. So maybe somebody was referred to treatment due to concerns about gambling problem. So an operationally defined problem here would be John's weekly score on an individualized scale of intensity of urges to gamble. So each week they would monitor or report on their urges to gamble throughout the week. So once we've got that information, we could look at the client's self-report, their report on a gambling brief situational confidence questionnaire, but we could also look at a third party's report of what was going on. So a verifying source could be their spouse, or maybe their bank statement saying how much money they've spent on gambling, or if they've asked for any kind of cash advances. And oftentimes we can see the outcome goal pretty easily. We would want them to abstain from gambling, but an intermediate goal could be like a step along the way in order to decrease their urges to gamble. And then lastly, coming up with an intervention that could be evidence-based, could be like weekly cognitive behavioral booster sessions for the next month. So meeting with the client or meeting with you to discuss cognitive interventions for addressing gambling and disorder. So within a goals table, we often talk about assessment, procedures, and results. So a multidimensional assessment could be completed to assess for gambling urges. This could be something from like the DSM or like a standardized measure or assessment of gambling disorder. And facilitative goals would be something that would be implemented along the way to kind of help address the gambling. So it could be potentially motivational interviewing or some type of intervention package that would help to address intensity of urges to gamble. Or maybe it would just be getting them out of situations where they may have intense urges to gamble, such as avoiding a certain area or a certain group of people that they might be gambling with. And additional comments could be something like they would be expected to get their tax return or something like that. Like they might be coming up with new money and they're more likely to have urges to gamble. So this is just an example of setting up a single system design that's used from the 793 course. And hopefully this just gives you an overview of what a single system design setup might look like. And how do we determine frequency, duration, interval, magnitude? Most of the time, I view it as best to try to measure the smallest increment possible. There's pros and cons of this, because if somebody's measuring too much, they're likely to not take the measurements as seriously and maybe not put as much effort to it. But if we're taking too long of intervals, then it's kind of harder to determine whether or not the single system design is actually effective. So all things to discuss with your client, and kind of based on the client concern as well. So who should be measuring? Should it be the client themselves? Should it be the social worker? Should it be an agency? This can depend on a few different things as well. So potentially if they're an adult and they're responsible, they might be able to do their own measurement, but certainly with children, it might be their teacher or their parent or a neutral third party. And it's good to have two people measuring the same thing, because then we have some kind of triangulation that can go on to see if those measures are accurate or if there's potentially some misrepresentation going on. So in analyzing single system design, there's a visual analysis that goes on. Level, trend, and variation are three important things to look at the graph. So the level is the intensity of the outcome. Trend, again, is whether or not there's any kind of upward or downward, increasing positive trend or decreasing negative trends that we can observe in the data. And variability is if there's kind of like a up and down, almost like a zigzag type of thing going on. So in this example, we can see level with anxiety and the anxiety ratings and class ratings. We can see the level would be kind of like the peak where in the first phases of either the top or the bottom, they're around 25. So that's their level. Trends would either be going upwards or downward. And in any of these data, it looks like it's pretty stable, but you can imagine some like zigzag patterns where maybe one class are really anxious, another class they're not. I'm also going to be covering interpretation of visual patterns and problems with interpretation. So in the visual analysis, based on that graph I just showed you, level is the amount or the magnitude of the target variable. And how has it changed from the baseline to the intervention phase? Has it remained pretty consistent, or has there been like a big gap once the intervention has been implemented? Did they significantly shoot up with anxiety, or did they significantly decrease? And through the graphing, we can kind of explain some of that away. Regarding trend, has the intervention altered the direction of the trend? If the baseline trend is ascending, is the trend line descending in the treatment phase? So again, is it ascending? Is their anxiety getting worse during the baseline? Is it decreasing during the intervention? Things that we can better get an idea of by looking at these graphs. And variability, obviously, how different are the scores themselves? Is there a lot of variation associated with the intervention from the baseline, or are things more or less kind of stable? So when you're interpreting visual patterns, you're going to want to test for clinical significance. Has the intervention made a meaningful difference in the well-being of the subject? So there's a difference between statistical significance and clinical significance. Oftentimes we're obsessive with whether or not there's been a statistically significant change, but sometimes there's a clinically significant change where if you can see there's a big decrease in anxiety, that can be really clinically meaningful to the client and kind of helping us to assess our goals. Also, in some more standardized measures, we might want to set criteria, cut scores, and kind of look at what kind of goal we're trying to get at. So if we're using a standardized measure of anxiety on a scale of 1 to 16, let's say, and 8 is our anxiety or our cutoff for a significant level of anxiety, we might want to say that we want the average to be below that 8 point. And then that would be our criteria for our measuring the outcome of our intervention. So some problems with interpretation, you can imagine if there's discrepant scores within the baseline, if there's some really, really lows and some really, really highs, sometimes that can be hard to explain away. So we do some tests of autocorrelation to see if there's really independence of observations. And if there's not, we might need to take a moving average before we do any kind of statistical analysis. Again, probably beyond the scope of this course, but still an important thing to be aware of. And you might learn more if you do end up taking 793. Also, it's probably worth mentioning, and maybe something that people don't think about enough, is that there can be a delayed change. In the real world setting, sometimes when people start an intervention, things might actually get worse before they get better. So you can think of an example of maybe somebody who is processing their trauma history, for instance. I've always told people if I'm going to be working with them with a prolonged exposure or like a cognitive processing therapy for addressing trauma, most of the time their mood's going to get worse before it gets better, because you're addressing some of those things that you've been avoiding for a long time. And so you might not feel better at first, but through exposure-based treatment, people learn the tools that they need to be able to focus on and address those issues of trauma. But sometimes there's delayed change, and it's important to be aware of that. Other problems with interpretation is that improvements in baseline can start encroaching on results, co-founding the results of the actual intervention. So again, if their baseline is showing improvement, then maybe we can look at different statistical methods to see if the intervention caused an acceleration of improvement, for instance. So there's several types of single system design. There's a basic AB, baseline intervention, which is what I've been talking about. There's also withdraw designs, concurrent multiple baselines, multiple treatment designs, monitoring client progress, and SSDs with group interventions. And I'm going to try to break these down a little bit. So the AB is just basic baseline intervention and can be used for research, evaluation, and client monitoring. But one of the downsides is that it cannot rule out history, and it can really only show correlation. It can't really explain away other possible variables that could be leading to changes in the intervention phase. So again, this is just an AB. You could think of like one possible way to explain the decrease in the intervention phase here could be through meeting with an instructor about the course after week 7, they maybe feel more comfortable. Or another possible explanation is maybe they quit their job after week 7 and started meeting with the instructor. And then it's hard to tell whether or not it's quitting the job or meeting with the instructor, which is really the stimulus here. So it could be the intervention itself, or it could be a third variable that we're not really accurately accounting for with the data. There's also withdrawal designs, which is like an A-B. Some of the benefits of this would be that it can prove causality because we can show with the intervention phase that there is an association with a certain type of outcome variable. One of the downsides is if something's working, why would you withdraw it? So oftentimes people do this in a fact where somebody drops out of treatment and then re-enters treatment, and then you would just start to reevaluate the same outcome variable. So here's an A-B design. So there's a baseline and then an intervention phase. So maybe at the end of the intervention phase, you can see at class 8, their anxiety became manageable, it's subclinical, and then they're fine. And so then they withdraw the intervention, and on the top, you can see that their anxiety shot up. So maybe it's time for them to go back into treatment. And then in the final phase, it goes down again. But on the bottom, figure 8.11, maybe after withdrawing the treatment in their maintenance phase or their second baseline, they're still doing fine. But maybe kind of like some booster sessions in the second intervention phase almost got rid of their anxiety entirely. There's a few different ways that you can do this. And through A-B design, we have a little bit more strength behind our discussion about causality. So concurrent multiple baseline designs is implemented concurrently for at least 3 cases. Client, target, problem, and setting, and there's a staggering of the length of the baseline to control for history of the cases. Also with multiple treatment designs, the nature of the intervention changes over time, and each change represents a new phase of the intervention. So there might be a baseline, intervention 1, intervention 2, intervention 3. So that's another way that people do these single system designs. So if you're monitoring client progress and there's no baseline information, monitoring designs can also still be used to identify progress. So if we're doing just an intervention phase or an intervention phase followed by a baseline phase, this can still give us some good client data. And I'm hoping that if you haven't done baseline, you've at least kind of done some monitoring of intervention progress. And sometimes you can do continued monitoring even after the intervention, like a maintenance phase or a baseline following an intervention. Also, there's single subject designs with a group, or sometimes it's called single system design, which is similar but used with a larger level group. Maybe it can be a family, it can be a class, or any kind of group really. So regarding evidence-based practice, there's ways to enhance external validity of single system design. When you're creating an SSD, you want to make sure that it's directly replicable. So when you're explaining the goals table, it should be easily replicable by a different person in the same situation. There's systematic replication, which is repeating the whole experiment within a different setting. So maybe an inpatient versus an outpatient, and clinical replication, which is combining different interventions into a clinical package to treat multiple problems at the same time. And some thoughts about single system design within diverse society. Single systems design should be considered for diverse populations because especially if there isn't as much research for a certain design with a certain population, or maybe they're just under researched or historically underrepresented in research. SSDs can kind of tailor our intervention specifically to their needs and make it more suitable or specifically addressed to the client problem that we might be observing. And then that way we can kind of tailor the intervention to be culturally sensitive or culturally appropriate for the best outcomes possible. Some ethical issues with single subject design is to remember that since research is focused on an individual unit, it's careful to obtain informed consent from each and every participant, especially if you're going to be doing a baseline and withdrawing any kind of intervention for a period of time. So especially if you're going to be doing the baseline, informed consent becomes a huge issue here, because why would you not give somebody an intervention just for the purposes of seeing if your intervention was really effective? So that's where informed consent becomes really important with single system design.